The foreman at Kendall Farm Supply in Atchison County, Missouri, laughed on a Tuesday morning in March of 2003. Not a long laugh, just the short, reflexive kind that comes out of a man when something strikes him as so obviously unreasonable that he doesn't have time to be polite about it. The thing that struck him was a 15-year-old boy named Garrett Hull standing at the back of the lot, pointing at a row of blown engine blocks pulled from a line of dead case tractors, a 7130 with a cracked head, two 5130s with rod knock damage, and a 7240 that had thrown a piston somewhere outside Effingham the summer before. They were stacked on pallets along the back fence, rusting in the March drizzle, worth nothing to anyone with a practical mind. Garrett wanted all four. He didn't want to buy them. He didn't have money. He was asking if he could have them. The foreman, his name was Terry Hutchins, 31 years in equipment and not inclined to change his opinions late in the game, told him he could take them if he could move them. Then he went inside to get more coffee, because there was nothing else to say. A 15-year-old boy and 4 engine blocks in the rain. That was not a situation that required a great deal of further analysis. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. He had been wrong about it for 11 years by the time he figured that out. Most people who watch stories like this scroll past without ever subscribing. But if you've ever been underestimated, talked over, or dismissed because of how young or small you looked, stay with us. Subscribe. This one is for you. To understand what Garrett was doing with those engine blocks, you have to understand what Atchison County, Kansas, the Missouri side's mirror image across the river, looked like in 2003 to a kid who was paying attention to it. The Missouri River bottom country through there is rich ground, heavily farmed, and in the early 2000s it was in the first wave of a long transition from smaller family operations to larger cash-rent enterprises that needed more equipment, bigger equipment, and a place to get it fixed when it broke. The dealerships in Atchison and Leavenworth had backlogs. Independent shops ran 6 to 8 weeks out. If a farmer had a planter down in May or a combine down in August, the wait was long and the bill was longer. Garrett had noticed this the way a quiet person notices things, without announcing it. He'd grown up helping his uncle, Darvis Hull, fix equipment on a 640-acre row crop operation outside Huron, Missouri. Darvis was not a man who believed in paying someone else to do something you could figure out yourself, and he had communicated that belief to Garrett mostly through silence. The kind of silence that falls over a shop when a 15-year-old is doing something wrong, and the older man decides to wait and see whether the boy figures it out before saying anything. Sometimes Garrett figured it out. Sometimes he didn't. And then Darvis would say one sentence and walk away, and Garrett would stand there holding a wrench until the sentence made sense. That was most of his education. One sentence at a time. Darvis was 64 in 2003, starting to slow down, and had told Garrett without a great deal of ceremony that the boy was going to need to figure out a way to make a living that didn't depend on someone else handing it to him. He did not mean this harshly. He meant it the way you mean things when you can see a little further down the road than the person you're talking to. What Garrett had figured out on his own sometime in the winter of 2002 was that the gap in Atchison County wasn't labor. It wasn't knowledge. It was parts. Specifically, it was rebuilt engines. A short block rebuild on a Case H 7130 ran $9,800 to $12,400 at a dealership in 2003. A farmed-out rebuild at an independent machine shop wasn't much less. A farmer looking at that number, looking at a field that needed to be planted in the next 9 days, was in a very uncomfortable position. Garrett had a theory that a person could do those rebuilds for considerably less if they had the cores to start from and the time to do the work. He had time. What he didn't have were cores. Engine cores cost money. even bad ones, unless, of course, someone thought they were worthless and was willing to hand them to a 15-year-old boy for free, largely to see what would happen. Which is exactly how Garrett ended up in Terry Hutchins's yard on a rainy Tuesday asking for 4 blown case blocks. He borrowed a hay trailer from Darvis, loaded the blocks with a come-along, 2 pieces of pipe, and a hand pallet jack that took him the better part of a morning to operate without tipping anything. He drove them back to Darvis's shop in Darvis's F-250. Darvis watched him back the trailer in, said nothing, and went back inside. The first block, the 7130 with a cracked head, took Garrett 4 months to rebuild. He was wrong about several things during that process. He made 2 mistakes that required him to start sections over, once on the bearing clearances and once on the valve seat depth, which he had cut 1/1000th too deep on 3 of the exhaust ports. He knew they were wrong because Darvis walked through one evening, picked up the head, looked at it for about 4 seconds, and said, "Valve seats." Then he set it down and left. Garrett stayed in the shop until 11 o'clock that night and fixed the valve seats. The rebuilt 7130 short block sold in August of 2003 to a farmer named Gerald Pacheco outside Lancaster, Kansas, who had a machine in the shop and had been quoted $11,200 by the dealership in Atchison. Garrett charged him $3,900. He didn't undercut the dealership on quality. The tolerances were right. The bearings were new. The seals were new. The machine passed a leak-down test. He undercut them on overhead. He had no building payment. He had no employees. He had no salesman. He had a borrowed shop, a come-along, and 4 months of evenings. The margin after parts was $2,040. He was 15 years old. He went back to Kendall Farm Supply the following spring. Terry Hutchins was in the lot when he pulled up. Garrett asked if there were any more cores going to the pile. Terry looked at him. He thought for a moment. Then he said that there might be, and what was the boy using them for? Garrett told him. Terry Hutchins was quiet for a while after that. He did not laugh this time. He went inside and came back with a cup of coffee and stood there in the lot thinking about it. And then he said he might know of 2 or 3 other operations that had cores sitting around they hadn't figured out what to do with. Garrett said he'd be interested. That was the beginning of an informal supply arrangement that ran for the next 6 years. Terry Hutchins was not a man who would ever fully admit he had been wrong about something. But he started calling Garrett in the winters when cores came in, and that is a kind of admission. Between 2003 and 2014, Garrett rebuilt and sold 78 short block and long block units, Case primarily, some John Deere, 4 Caterpillar diesels that came out of a flooded grain operation in Leavenworth County in 2008. He did the early years in Darvis's shop. After 2007, he rented a bay from a retired auto mechanic in Effingham for $325 a month, which he considered expensive but manageable. He had no website until 2009. He had no business cards until 2006. Most of his work came from word of mouth, specifically from Gerald Pacheco, who told 2 neighbors, who told 3 more, who called the number written on a piece of paper that had been sitting on someone's dashboard since 2004. He is 36 now. He runs whole diesel rebuild out of a 800-square-foot shop he built on 6 acres outside Effingham in 2017. He has 4 employees, a CNC reboring machine, and a parts inventory worth roughly $280,000 at cost. He turns away work between February and April because he is booked. His average ticket in 2024 ran $4,600 for a short block and $7,100 for a long block. The dealership in Atchison charges $13,500 for a comparable long block job. He has a 3-week lead time. They have 6. Darvis Hull died in 2019 at the age of 80. He had lived long enough to see the shop built, which Garrett thinks he would say is about as much as a man can ask for. He didn't say that. He didn't say much about it at all, being Darvis. But he came out to the shop once in the spring of 2018 and walked through it slowly, looking at the machines and the organized shelves and the cores stacked along the far wall, waiting for their turn. He ran his hand along the surface of the Rottler boring machine the way you touch something you know was done right. That was enough. For Garrett, anyway. He knew what it meant. Terry Hutchins retired from Kendall Farm Supply in 2014. He came to the shop opening in 2017. Garrett had not invited him. He'd mailed an announcement to the county, and Terry was in the county. But he came. He stood around for a while. He had a cup of coffee, which seems to be a habit he maintains through significant events. Before he left, he found Garrett and told him that he had told that story, the engine blocks in the rain, the boy with the come-along, more times than he could count over the years. He said people always asked him what he thought at the time. He said he always told them the truth. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd seen in a long time. Then he shook Garrett's hand and drove home. He wasn't wrong to laugh. Exactly, the picture was what it was. A boy in the rain, 4 dead blocks, a come-along borrowed from his uncle. The picture didn't have enough information in it to tell you what was going to happen next. Most pictures don't. That's the thing about a 15-year-old who's been taught by a man who speaks one sentence at a time. You don't know what they know. You don't know what they've been turning over in their head all winter while everyone else was talking. You just see a kid in a parking lot asking for something that seems, on the surface, to be worth exactly what you're charging for it. Nothing. Which, as it turned out, was exactly the right price.